Can they talk or can they not? I don't know. Yeah.
Maybe more than that.
Anytime we're full. Yeah,
Yeah, because we correspond.
Stop passing the interview. All set? Okay. Assalamu alaikum, brothers and sisters. Thank you so much for being here tonight. We're being recorded in a couple of different ways, and so apologies if we look awkward with all the microphones and wiring. My name is Zahra Billoo, and I'm joined by my colleague Yaman Salahi, who's with I'm with CAIR, the Council on American Islamic Relations. Yaman is with the Asian Law Caucus, Advancing Justice Asian Law Caucus. And I'd actually also like to introduce my colleague Fatima Iqbal, who is sitting in the audience, maybe just want to raise her hand. She's a staff attorney at CAIR. And so how many of you here have not heard of CAIR before? Okay, good. So just as a refresher, so I say it because I want to be able to say I said it. In case you don't know and were embarrassed to raise your hand, CAIR is the Council on American Islamic Relations. We're the nation's largest American Muslim civil rights advocacy organization. We have chapters in over 24 states, including one right here in Santa Clara. And what we do is promote justice, enhance understanding, and empower American Muslims. And a large part of that is providing direct civil rights services, legal advice, assistance, and representation to people who are complaining of discrimination because they're Muslim or mistaken for Muslim. A significant number of those complaints in the last decade plus have been government intrusions on our civil liberties. And so when people are visited by the FBI or they have travel issues or really any other government violation of their civil rights, we intervene, we provide representation and assistance. But we recognize that people don't always know where to call for help or when to call for help, right? And so that's why we do these Know Your Rights workshops as well, as that it's not enough to just put a Band-Aid on the problem when something happens. We want to get out and talk to the community, make sure that all of you know what your rights are, know how to assert them, and know where you can get that help. And so as part of that effort, we do these workshops in masajid and community centers. We focus on various issues, but the FBI is one that we do sort of on an ongoing basis. We've done one at the Yaseen Foundation a number of times, and we do them across the Bay Area. And we're really hopeful that all of you will take back what you hear today to your families and your communities. Yaman and I and Fatima and I can really only reach a certain number of people, and we rely on you to carry the word further. And so I'll actually ask Yaman to introduce his organization as well.
Thank you, Zahra. Thank you for having us over tonight at the mosque. It's really an honor to be here. My name is Yaman Salahi, and I'm a staff attorney at the Asian Law Caucus in San Francisco. We have a national security and civil rights program, and what we focus on in that program is post-9/11 discrimination and surveillance of Muslim, Middle Eastern, and South Asian communities in the broader Bay Area. And so we work very closely with CAIR on a number of issues, and we also provide free representation and legal advice to people who have questions about law enforcement, who have been approached for questioning or have had trouble traveling, and other similar issues. So I'm going to leave it at that and let Zahra start.
So we're going to approach tonight's workshop from two issue areas. The first is law enforcement interactions, and then a second and related piece is travel issues. And so Yaman will talk about travel, and I'll talk about law enforcement. I never ask the audience to raise their hands for this question, so please don't. But I imagine that some of you may have, in the last 12 years, been visited by the FBI. And if not you personally, then maybe you know somebody who has. Generally, when I've asked in my social circles, either everyone has been visited or at least someone in their immediate family has been visited. So it's a growing problem. It's not something that's slowed down. And so what I was going to do is just walk you through what your rights are when that happens and a couple of key points. I talk fast and I talk a lot, and we're going to cover a lot of material tonight. And so I ask that if you really only remember two things that I say, it should be that you always have the right to an attorney and you always have the right to remain silent. You have those rights when you're interacting with law enforcement irrespective of your citizenship status. So you could have been born and raised in the United States. You could have, you could be like fourth generation American. You could also be an undocumented immigrant and you would still always have those rights. They're true whether you're in jail or at your home or at your masjid. You always have the right to remain silent and the right to an attorney. Most of the interactions that we get complaints of happen at home. So people are being visited at their homes. It's a lot of times in the morning. And 2 points really quickly. One is the morning is when you're least expecting guests, right? You're sort of caught off guard. A lot of the complaints we get, people are just waking up or they're just headed to work. If we've literally had college students, the FBI comes in and says, go wash your face. Like they're that asleep when that happens. And that's sort of a time when you're most vulnerable because you're really not all there yet. Sometimes it's families that are leaving for work, they're going to school, and the FBI greets them at their doorstep. In most cases, it's FBI agents traveling in pairs, so they do come as twos. Sometimes it happens at home, sometimes it happens on the street, but again, most of the time sometimes it happens at work and sometimes it's on the street, but most of the time it's at home. What I always tell people is the first step is, what should you not do when a stranger shows up at your door? Any suggestions? What should you not do? Not invite them in, right? Okay, good. It's an obvious one, but it's something that I think we repeat over and over because it's easy to forget when you're nervous. So, you're getting ready for work, you're at home, you hear a knock on the door, and you open the door, and you don't recognize who the person outside is, right? It could be someone selling Girl Scout cookies, someone selling you a vacuum, or the FBI. They're a stranger, so you probably shouldn't invite them in. We advise clients to, the agents will identify themselves. They'll say, I'm Agent Joe Smith, and I'm Agent Ben I'm not going to use a real name, Ben Young. And, I'd like to ask you a few questions. So they're really upfront about identifying themselves. So they've identified themselves. They're law enforcement. You don't want to invite them in. So what you actually want to do is you want to step outside and close the door behind you. There are 3 ways that law enforcement can get into your home. The first is a search warrant. That's the most obvious. And so if they say, can we come in, and they're sort of insisting on that, you can ask, do you have a search warrant? A search warrant is an official document. It's going to be signed by a judge. It's going to have required that law enforcement went to the judge to tell them why they needed to enter your house. If they do have a search warrant, you should let them in. You should never physically get in their way. This is another baseline rule, never physically obstruct the work of law enforcement, whether it's during a traffic stop or them at your house. If you do that, you will get hurt. And later, when you try to recover damages, it's going to be very difficult, right? Like never physically, always verbally object. So if they have a search warrant, you want to let them in the house, you still have the right to remain silent and the right to an attorney. In the majority of cases, they won't have a search warrant. I can say confidently that I think in over 90% of cases that CAIR has seen in the last 3 years that we have not seen search warrants. These are generally just, they're hoping that you will invite them in. So search warrant, and then invite them in is the other way. And then the third way they come in is if there's an emergency. So if they're in pursuit, if they are trying to find a criminal, if there's a domestic dispute, if it's something where they're not even going to stop to ask you, can I come in? And again, you never want to physically get in their way. In the majority of cases, none of those things will happen. You have the choice. Do you let them in or do you not let them in? We, of course, advise that you should not let them in. The reason for that, there's a couple of reasons for that. The first is your right to privacy in your own home is sacred, right? Like it's something that the founders enshrined in our founding documents, in our Bill of Rights, because they wanted to make sure that you could do what you wanted to in your home, whether it's how many times a day you pray, or what books you're reading, or what you watch on TV, or any of those things. And so first and foremost, it's a very American thing to say, I have a right to privacy in my home. The second reason is anything that they see at your house, they can ask you questions about, right? So you let them in and they want to talk to you about Palestine, and you're like, I'm not really a Palestine activist, except there's a book about Hamas on your coffee table. You are legally free to have that book. You're not legally required to answer those questions, but do you really want to deal with law enforcement knowing what books you're reading? The third is, you don't know why they're there. It's possible that they will arrest you. If they arrest you, then they can search the area around you. That's going to be what's in your living room. That's going to be what's in your kitchen, if that's where you met with them. If you met with them on the front porch and you take your shoes off the way most of us do outside, the best they're going to find is what kind of sneakers you wore and maybe your socks from yesterday. So you step outside, you close the door behind you. They've identified themselves. They're going to ask you, are you brother Muhammad Ali? Are you, brother Yusuf? The only thing you are legally required to tell them at this point is your name. That's it. There's some debate about whether or not you should provide them with ID if you're asked. In the majority of cases, if they're coming to you at your house, they're not going to ask you for ID. If they're meeting you on the street, so if a law enforcement agent stops you on the street, he may or may not ask you for ID. Again, there's a debate about whether or not you should provide it. We generally advise people that even though you're not required to provide the ID, that sometimes doing that can speed up the interaction and make things go quickly. So they've identified themselves, you're outside, you've said your name. They're going to say, look, we just want to ask you a few questions. Can we talk to you for a few minutes? And the thing that we advise people to remember is you have the right to remain silent and the right to an attorney. We strongly recommend that you assert those rights. And the thing that we do in these workshops that sort of feels a little bit like kindergarten, but I'm going to ask you to do it with me anyways, is to say with me, my attorney will call you. Say it. Everybody say it. Say it like you mean it.
My attorney will call you.
Okay. Now this is the question I'll ask you to raise your hands for. How many of you here have ever gotten a speeding ticket? I've gotten like 5. Okay, right? So everyone's gotten one of those speeding tickets. Most people can relate to how scared you are when the cop pulls you over and you're waiting for him to come talk to you, right? Like whether or not you were speeding, whether or not you did anything wrong, you're sitting there, you have your hands on the steering wheel and you're terrified. You don't know how much it's gonna cost you, you don't know if he's gonna be mean, you don't know if he was racially profiling, you may not even know why he stopped you. And you're just so scared. Imagine that fear and then amplify it probably times 10 or 100 if it's law enforcement visiting you at your house and you don't even know what you did wrong or why they're there. If you're not comfortable saying my attorney will call you, you're likely not going to say it for the first time when the FBI is at your front doorstep. It's just not going to happen. That fear will paralyze you. And so being comfortable with those words is really important in advance of the situation. So, we'd like to ask you a few questions. You should just say, look, like, my attorney will call you. Get their business card. Getting the business card is really important because, again, the fear will paralyze you. You won't remember the details. You'll want some documentation that gives you the name of the agents, where they're from, how you get a hold of them, etc. Get the business card and send them on their way. This is not as easy as it sounds sometimes. I've talked a little bit about the fear, but the agents themselves can engage in very problematic behavior. A confession from me, I watch a lot of Law & Order SVU. I don't know if other people watch it, but I do. I watch a lot of it. And I don't tell people that you can learn things from television, but I feel like you can from Law & Order SVU. You see good cop and bad cop. It's sort of classic. It's not just Law & Order, like it's a lot of these shows, right? Good cop wants to be your friend. They're trying to save you. So it's sort of like, look, we're just doing outreach in the community. We want to make sure we can do our job. We're trying to get to know Muslims. Can you just help us out? Like they're going to appeal to the friend in you. Bad cop might threaten you or try to intimidate you, right? Like, why do you need an attorney? What are you afraid of? What are you trying to hide? If you do this, we're going to make it complicated for you. And so that's bad cop. It's really important that you stay firm to your rights, that you assert that your attorney will just call them, that's it. You have nothing else to say because they're going to try to break it. It's why they travel in pairs. They sort of work off that. And a lot of people will sometimes say, look, my attorney will call you, and then they'll keep talking to the agents. And one of the things that we see in our community is this thing that, like, maybe I can outsmart them. Like, I know what I'm doing, right? Like, I know that I'm not going to get in trouble. I hear this a lot. And it's usually from people who get in trouble because the agents are professionals at what they do. This is likely your second or third interaction with law enforcement ever. And that's assuming you've gotten some speeding tickets. If you've never gotten a speeding ticket, you may never have had this interaction. And so you're not going to outsmart them. And it's not worth trying. The risks are too high. People will sometimes ask me, why? Why should I assert my rights? Like, what are the risks, right? Like, you're telling me that I should be careful. You're telling me that things happen. What happens? So for starters, in over 90% of cases where people assert their rights, law enforcement leaves them alone. Like, overwhelmingly, we have found that if the community member says, look, my attorney will call you, it doesn't go very far. We've also seen that over and over again, where the community member sits down and talks to the agent, there's never just one call. A couple of weeks later, they call. A couple of months later, they call. Why? Because you become an easy access point to the community. They're trying to get information about American Muslims. They think they're trying to stop terrorism. And the more you cooperate with them, it just becomes easier. So if there are two brothers, one cooperates and the other doesn't, two brothers as in community members, one cooperates and the other doesn't, one asserts their right and the other doesn't, who do they keep coming back to? The person that continues to have the conversation with them. And every time you have that conversation, you're feeding them a little bit of information. We advise people that when you assert your rights, you're not just protecting yourself, you're also protecting your community and your family, because they're not just going to ask you about you. They want to know who goes to your masjid. They want to know who goes to that Syria rally with you, who goes to the Trayvon Martin rally with you. They want to know which charity you gave money to. So again, why? And this is sort of where I'll stop, is why is it important that you assert your rights? A few things. Everything that you say to law enforcement is on the record. Everything. Right? So you're thinking about an answer, you fumble on it, you guess. That's on the record. They could come back and ask you more questions about it. Another reason is many people don't realize this, but you're not allowed to lie to law enforcement. Right? You're not allowed to lie. Most Muslims will respond to this and say, I'm not afraid of the FBI, I'm afraid of Allah, and Allah teaches, like, I'm prohibited from lying as a Muslim. Here's the thing, making a mistake in a conversation can also be construed as lying. Simple mistake about, like, when the last time I went to Pakistan was. Was it June of 2006 or June of 2007? I don't really remember. But if it's a mistake that impacts their investigation, I could find myself in hot water. The media, I think, sometimes leads us to believe, even as Muslims ourselves, that a lot of Muslims are going to jail for terrorism. And that's actually not true. A lot of Muslims are going to jail for lying to the FBI, and then they're also going to jail for white-collar offenses. Because remember I mentioned that if you let them in the first time, they keep coming back? Well, after they visited you 6 or 7 times, and they've got no terrorism charges to pin on you, what are they going to find? Mortgage fraud, immigration fraud, tax fraud, things that might have been innocent white-collar mistakes, right, what we call sometimes victimless crimes, and I'm not saying that those are okay or that you should be committing them, but things that are very different from terrorism. But if they've got nothing else to pin on you, but they notice that you bought 3 houses and your IRS paperwork doesn't match up, then they're going to start asking some of those questions. Might have been unintentional. You'll still face the consequences. You're not allowed to lie to them. You're not allowed to make mistakes. The same is not true for them. They are allowed to lie to you, right? There are absolutely no consequences when law enforcement lies to you. They want to ask Brother Yusuf if he knows Brother Muhammad, and Brother Yusuf is like, no, I don't think so. Well, Brother Muhammad said that you guys were really good friends and you had lunch a couple of months ago. It's that easy, right? And what happens then? They start to question themselves. The community members who are being questioned will start to doubt themselves, and it may get them to trip up. So they're allowed to lie to you. The last piece that I'll say on this is that you don't know anything about these people. What did I say at the beginning? They're strangers at your doorsteps. If you remember to ask for the business card, you have a business card, so you know their name and what agency they're with. That's it. What do they know about you? They know where you live, they know where you work, they probably know a little bit about your taxes, a little bit about your travel, maybe something about your charitable giving, and most importantly, they know why they're there. They know why they decide to visit Brother Muhammad today. They're like, well, we want to talk to him about that trip to Kuwait and like his activism in Syria, etc. You don't know anything. So like in terms of the balance of power when it comes to information, they have all of the information and you have nothing. And so what we strongly advise people to do is assert your rights. Remember that you have the right to remain silent and the right to an attorney. Whoever's recording is also getting a phone call, just as an FYI in case it's urgent. So with that in mind, assert those rights and seek help. What I've said over and over is that when you seek help, we find that law enforcement will leave you alone. Many people will say, well, I don't know where to find a lawyer. I don't know how to get help. I can't afford a lawyer. CAIR, Advancing Justice Asian Law Caucus, the ACLU, the National Lawyers Guild, and actually a number of private attorneys provide these services for free. It's not because we don't fundraise or we don't need the money to pay our staff and provide the services, but it's because at that moment when the FBI is at your doorstep, you should not have to worry about whether or not you can afford $200, $300 an hour. You should just know that there's help available. And so what do? You call a lawyer, you get the free legal help. The questions that we'll ask you will be like, what happened? What was your interaction like? What did they say? What agency were they from? Have you had previous interactions with law enforcement? We'll walk you through sort of what we call an intake. And then if you choose to work with the attorneys, we'll call the agents on your behalf. We'll say, look, I represent Brother Muhammad. I understand you were interested in speaking to him. Sometimes the agents won't even bother to return the call because they know if this person has asserted their rights that they can't get any sort of loose, reckless information about the community out of them. Sometimes they'll return the call and they'll say, well, we want to talk to them about their masjid and we're just doing outreach and we want to talk to them about Iran and Syria and Palestine and Pakistan. And sometimes they'll call with an actual legitimate request, like, look, we're investigating the situation, like we have some questions, we want to know if your client can help us. The job of the attorney is to go back to the client and say, look, this is what the agent said. Specifically, it's about, or most importantly, if there are questions about religion, politics, community organizing, your worship, anything like that, then the advice is pretty straightforward, that you have no obligation and there's really no reason to talk to law enforcement about any of those things, that we are protected from ever having to speak to law enforcement about our religion and politics. But if it's about something that you may or may not have information on, that may or may not open up liabilities for you, or you may or may not have a desire to share, then the attorney is going to work with you to reach a decision that makes the most sense for you. The attorney will advise you, they'll walk you through what the risks are, what the benefits are, and help you reach a decision. In the majority of cases, again, it's such a small minority of cases where any of these actually advance to an in-person interview with the FBI, that I always say the majority of cases. So in the majority of cases, it won't ever get to the interview stage, because either the agent's not going to call back, they're going to have inappropriate questions, or they may have what are appropriate questions, but the client will still decide, look, it's not in my best interest to risk everything and sit down with law enforcement. In the few cases where it does go forward, it's a job of the attorney to prepare the client for that interview, to make sure that all of the questions are outlined in advance, that it's very clear and explicit, that law enforcement has confirmed that the client themselves is not the target of an investigation, and then to accompany that client to the interview, to walk them through what's going to happen, and then to be there. Remember I said that the FBI agents are always in pairs. And so whatever happens, if there's two of them and one of you, is that it's your word against them, right? I wasn't going 85 miles an hour, I was going 76. But the agent or the police officer might say I was going 85 or 87, and it'll be his word against mine. And so when the attorney accompanies you to an interview with the FBI, it's specifically, one of the reasons is to prevent that if there is any dispute later, there are two of you, the client and the attorney, who will say, well, this is what I said, and that you'll disagree with the agents. The role of the attorney then is also to be your advocate in that meeting. So for example, if you agreed on 5 specific questions in advance and you were prepared to answer those 5 questions, and the FBI agents want to ask you question number 6, 7, and 8, the role of the attorney is to step in and say, no, we didn't agree to those, right? Or like, my client is not willing to answer those questions at this time. And so things of that sort. And so the last thing actually I'll mention that we don't normally mention, but is a new problem that we're seeing. So these FBI visits happen, assert your rights if they happen to you, but we've actually gotten probably half a dozen in the last month now, complaints of fake law enforcement calls. And so I want to put this out there, as just so that you know as well. A number of people in the community have gotten calls from people who claim to be DHS, IRS, FBI, or immigration service officers, and they'll try to get really sensitive information over the phone. Drug enforcement as well. Okay, so I haven't gotten that, but drug enforcement as well. So they're basically claiming to be federal law enforcement. They're claiming to be officers. They're very abrasive and intimidating over the phone, and they're asking a lot of times for personal information. Sometimes they're asking for money, and they're making threats. We strongly suggest that if you get a call from anyone claiming to be law enforcement, treat it the way you would any of those other calls. Do not provide any sensitive, personal, confidential information. Trust me, the government doesn't need your social security number. They have it. The FBI also doesn't want $10,000 from you. Like, it's sort of both funny and frightening, right? Like, if you don't know and you don't know where to go for help, it can be really frightening. And so treat those calls the way you would any other law enforcement calls. Don't provide any confidential, sensitive, personal information. Do not send any money. Do not do any wire transfers. And then call CAIR or one of the other agencies for help, so that we can walk you through and assess whether it's a legitimate call or not. If it's a legitimate call, we'll walk you through sort of that process. And if it's not a legitimate call, we'll help you file the complaints with the various agencies. And so I'll stop there and pass it over to Yaman to talk about travel.
Okay, so my part will be a little bit shorter. The one thing that I have to add to that is that sometimes what we've been noticing recently is that the FBI will call someone who has applied for asylum or who has relatives that are applying for immigration benefits. And that interview will take place and will take advantage of that person's feeling of insecurity, that if they don't cooperate, their asylum application will be denied, or their relatives' visa applications will be denied. It's very important to assert the same rights in that situation, because you're not obligated to speak to the FBI in that process, and it's not a normal step in the process. They might offer to help you out with that if you speak with them, but there's a rule about how visas are processed, there's a rule about how asylum paperwork is processed, and that's the rule that the government has to follow, and it doesn't help to permit the FBI to come and start bending those rules around for, promising favors or promising to hurt you if you refuse to talk to them. So even in that situation, it's important to be aware that you should still seek the advice of an attorney and not speak with them without having an attorney present. With respect to travel, I was going to quickly cover 3 issues. One is kind of your rights when you go through security at the airport. 2 is your rights when you're coming back to the United States from international travel. And 3, which is even shorter, is if you've had trouble traveling, like you've been thrown off an airplane or they wouldn't let you board an airplane, there's a way to deal with that situation. When you're going through the TSA line, usually the issue that comes up is when a sister who wears a hijab is going through. It's important to know that you have the right to wear that hijab going through the security line. They are allowed to, if they want to see if there are metal objects, for example, under the hijab, they're allowed to use a wand to go around it. They're allowed to ask to pat the hijab down, but you're also allowed to ask them to pat it down yourself. And after that, you'll touch your head and they'll take a sample from your arms to test in a chemical machine. But if they do then ask you to remove the hijab, you have the right to request to be taken to a private room and to be inspected by someone of the same gender. That tends to be the most common issue, but there are also instances where people get randomly selected while being Muslim or while being brown. And in that situation, it's always best to be polite. You have to comply with their request. They can take someone out for a more thorough inspection for basically any reason, but they're not allowed to do it as part of a racial profiling or religious profiling process. So if you do feel like that's happened to you, the best thing to do is to take down the information of the TSA agent who has subjected you to that. So take their name, take their badge information, and then later write it down as quickly as you can and contact CAIR or contact Asian Law Caucus, and we can help you file a complaint about that. But most people in the airport are just trying to get through and get to their flight. It's not usually something that anyone wants to cause a scene about, and it's not really helpful to cause a scene, actually. It's best to just kind of get through it, take down the information you need, and complain about it later if necessary. Coming back into the United States from travel abroad, there is a 2-part inspection process. The primary inspection is the part that everyone goes through when they come back from an international flight. The secondary inspection doesn't happen to everyone, but it can happen to basically anyone for any reason. It can happen to U.S. citizens and it can happen to non-U.S. citizens. For U.S. citizens, they are allowed to ask you questions about, where you're coming from, anything to verify your identity. But you also have the right not to answer the questions beyond that. You can say that because they're not allowed to deny you entry into the United States. It's a little bit different if you're not a U.S. citizen because there are circumstances in which they may deny you entry into the United States after you've already landed. So in that situation, they are allowed to ask you questions about your immigration status. But if they try to question you beyond that, for example, about what your religious beliefs are, what mosque you attend here in the Bay Area, what mosque you went to in whatever country you were coming from, that crosses the line into inappropriate questioning, and you can ask them to continue the questioning later when you have an attorney present. In that situation, too, it is important to take down the information of the person who has questioned you. It's also the case in that situation that they may search your baggage when you're coming back into the United States at the border. They don't need to have any specific evidence about you or a suspicion that you are carrying any contraband, for example. They can search anyone's baggage coming back into the U.S. They can search your person, your body. They can't do a strip search, though, unless they have reasonable suspicion that you're carrying some sort of illegal contraband. But if they do that, then they have to do it in a private area, of course. Usually what there's least clarity about at this point in time is electronic devices. So if you have your cell phone or you have a laptop with you, this is still being disputed in kind of the Western United States in the Ninth Circuit. There has been recently an appellate court decision that says that in order for them to do a deep forensic search of your electronic devices, so that would be like taking away your laptop, shipping it off for forensic analysis where they copy everything, they need to have reasonable suspicion that you're carrying illegal materials. But that has not yet been established outside of like California, Arizona, Washington State, Oregon, Idaho, yeah. But it is important to take down, if you find yourself in a situation where they do take your cell phone away or your laptop away, ask them to look through it in your presence. You can say you don't consent to the search. They might still search it anyway. Take down the information from them. If they take it to another room and bring it back to you, ask them what they did, what they took, if they copied anything, and write down all your notes about what they tell you so that you have a record of what happened and can file a complaint if necessary. And as I mentioned before, they can question you about your identity, they can question you about your immigration status, but they shouldn't be questioning you about your political beliefs or your activities or your religious beliefs and activities. So if it crosses that line, you can ask that the conversation stop. What that means is that before you travel internationally, pack with the expectation that everything you pack will be searched and seen and obtained by the border agents. So back up your files before you travel. If they take your laptop away and all of a sudden your hard drive crashes and you lose everything, that's not a good thing either. If you're not a US citizen, it's always a good idea to consult your immigration attorney before you do travel, so they can make sure that you have the proper status and the proper ability to return to the United States when you do come back. The other steps that we do suggest, just to reiterate what I've already said, is that if you are searched or chosen for secondary inspection, you're more than free to ask them why you've been selected for a secondary inspection. Try to get a reason from them. Of course, be polite. Don't be confrontational or abrasive with them, because that'll just make your life a little bit harder. And then if they do take any property away from you and don't return it to you at the end, ask for a receipt for what they've taken away so that you have a record that they took it away and can try to retrieve it later. The last issue has to do with travel problems. So if you've boarded a flight and because someone around you thought it was suspicious that you're reading a book with Arabic text and then you get removed from the flight, that's never a fun situation to be in. A pilot actually has the right to remove anyone from the flight if they have a reasonable belief that they have put the safety of the flight at risk. That, of course, doesn't include unreasonable things like they spoke in Arabic or they spoke in another language. But just to be aware, you shouldn't argue with the people who come onto the flight to remove you. That can make the situation a lot worse. You shouldn't make a joke like, I'm not carrying a bomb, why would you remove me? Because that also will make the situation worse. The other situation that people have is the no-fly list issue. If you, or actually kind of a permanent trouble getting onto a flight issue, if you have either of those problems, there's a process that you can appeal that through called the TRIP process. It's the Traveler Redress Inquiry Program, or process, I think. We don't know what that does yet, but one important thing that it does do is that you get a redress number. If you've booked a flight online recently, you see that there's a field now in the form for the redress number. That's the number you get when you file a TRIP request. And usually who that ends up helping out is someone who has a name that's similar to a name belonging to someone else that's on some sort of watch list. And that will make it easier for you to travel going forward. But if you are stuck outside of the United States and you're not being permitted to board a flight into the United States and you're a US citizen, there's a special phone number you can call at the State Department where they'll clear the way for you to return, because you have a constitutional right to return to the United States if you're a citizen of this country. So I think that covers the topics that I was going to talk about. If you do want to.
The one thing I will say about so I forgot something, but something I asked in the fly list issue is even so call the number from the State Department, but also call one of the legal organizations that we talked about tonight, because sometimes what we've seen is that they will ask you to meet with the FBI in another country. So we've actually had cases where the FBI has flown from Seattle, has flown from California to meet with people in the Middle East. without any American attorneys present. Like you're sort of caught between a rock and a hard place because you want to come home and they're telling you you have to speak to law enforcement. And so our work, like our organization's work at that time has always been like, look, like our clients are not consenting to interviews without an attorney present, right? Like you always have those rights. We've had clients being asked to take lie detector tests while sort of stuck in another country. I helped some people who were in Saudi Arabia and being asked to take a lie detector test without their attorney present in person. And it's like, that's obviously a bad situation. So as a citizen, you do have the right to return. So call the State Department, but also definitely call the organizations. The thing that I forgot to mention on the FBI piece is a lot of times community members will ask me, well, who gets visited by the FBI, right? Like, how do I make sure it doesn't happen to me? There are, I think, two sort of trends within people that are visited by the FBI, and they're really the only trends. One is they are majority male, like this audience, and so this sort of represents sort of the number of calls that we get, and they're most of the time men. I imagine it's about the same for you all, right? And why that is, I don't know. Maybe they're more afraid of Muslim men than Muslim women. We do get calls from women, so I never say that it's not important information for the women to have. It's also sometimes the women that are the mothers, that are the wives of the people that are visited. So sometimes it's the women that convince the men to assert their rights and protect themselves and their families. The other trend that we sometimes that we see across sort of clients is there is frequently a tie to foreign issues. So during the Arab Spring, people from Egypt, people from Tunisia, people from Libya were being visited. As a result of the ongoing uprising in Syria, we've seen a number of Syrians being visited. When they were looking for Anwar al-Awlaki, people in Yemen were being visited. When they were looking for Osama bin Laden, people in Pakistan and Afghanistan. And so there is sort of a tie there. When we want to invade a country, when our government takes an interest in another country, people who have connections to those countries are visited. But it's not just people who have ethnic connections or who are nationals of those countries, but also people who have visited. So with Yemen, for example, a lot of American Muslim converts go to Yemen to study Arabic, to learn about the religion. And so because they'd been to Yemen in the last few years, they would get visited by the FBI and ask questions about Yemen. Other than that, there are no guarantees about who does and who doesn't get visited. It's practicing Muslims, non-practicing Muslims, Sunnis and Shias, people who are involved politically, people who are not, people who are in masjid leadership, as well as people who maybe never attend the mosque or only come once in a while to pray. And so there's nothing that you can do to guarantee that you won't be visited by law enforcement, which is why it's always important to just know your rights, feel comfortable asserting them, and then hopefully help the people around you also feel comfortable asserting them. I think we'll stop there and take questions if there are questions.
Yeah, I have a question for you. You talk about your rights. If you are not accused, do you have the right to assert it still? If it was not investigation, just investigation.
Sure. So, I mean, is the question like if you're visited by the FBI but they're not charging you with anything? Yeah. Absolutely. So, and we actually strongly recommend that you assert your rights whether you are innocent or guilty. The example I always give people is, the worst thing to imagine is a person who is guilty of child molestation, right? Like a repeat offender in that regard who is guilty and has been convicted, because those are two separate things. That person in that scenario has the right to remain silent and the right to an attorney. The opposite end of the spectrum is someone who is civically engaged, is involved in their religious community, involved in politics, does well at work, is raising a good family, paying their taxes, not guilty of anything. That person also has the same exact rights. And the idea is that we treat everybody equally, everybody gets those rights. And what's interesting is for the innocent person, the idea is to make sure that they don't end up charged with anything, right? So I talked about the people who, it's not one visit, it's second visit, third visit, fourth visit. When they can't pin any terrorism on you, they find mortgage fraud, they find tax fraud, they find import-export fraud. Like, I've been amazed at the white-collar crimes that Muslims have been charged with, things that seem like innocent mistakes. There's a case right now of a woman, I think where's Ramsey Odea? She's Chicago. It's so there's a woman in Chicago who is a civic leader in her community, and she's now being charged with immigration fraud for a thing that she put down on her paperwork 20+ years ago, right? And so our objective as attorneys is to protect the innocent and the guilty, and particularly for the innocent to make sure that, if there's something on you that you don't know about, that law enforcement isn't handed it on a silver platter.
Also in response, technically, they say that these interview programs are entirely voluntary. And that's why you have the ability to say, no, I don't want to speak with you. If they've actually taken you into custody and they start interrogating you, that's when they have to say, you know, I'm advising you of your rights. You have the right to an attorney, you have the right to remain silent. Anything you say or do can will be used against you. And I only know that because of Law and Order. I did not learn that in law school. But so you have the same right to remain silent in both circumstances. The difference is that in a voluntary setting, they don't have to advise you of that right. You can still assert it, though. Yeah.
Absolutely, and especially, right.
Absolutely.
And I think the thing that I will say is also the majority of our clients, the overwhelming majority of our clients, I actually can't think of a single one of my clients in the last 3 to 3.5 years that's been charged with anything as a result of these visits. I can't speak for the other organizations, but like it's where someone is being charged with something, we're sending them directly to criminal defense counsel, but the community members that are ordinarily visited are never charged with anything.
Yeah, you start out with a 100% clean slate, innocent slate. Every word you say brings you down 1%, no matter what word it is. That's the best way to think about it.
You even have right not even to assert your right. Basically you can be silent 100%.
So
That used to be true.
that used to be true. When you are not in custody, you can be silent, you can go back inside the house, you close the door, you don't even have to open the door. We don't advise that because sometimes they'll go to your neighbors, and sometimes just the curiosity will get to you. So we advise people, come out, assert your rights, let the attorneys take care of it. When you are in custody, and this is just recent, you have to actually explicitly say, can I please have an attorney? I'm not talking to you, like I'm asserting my right to remain silent. If you do not do that, they can continue to sort of talk to you and badger you. And it's not like when you're at your house where you can go back inside and close the door. When you're in custody, they just talk to you every day until you break if you haven't asserted your rights.
Yeah, this was just a recent Supreme Court decision, and it was a case where someone was accused of a crime, and he was initially speaking with the interrogator. And then he was asked a specific question, and he stopped answering. He didn't say, I want to remain silent, I'm exercising my right to remain silent. He simply stopped talking. And the Supreme Court said, really in a decision that shocked a lot of constitutional law scholars, that because he didn't specifically say, I'm exercising my right to remain silent, his silence could be used as evidence of his guilt.
Yeah.
So,
And
in that specific situation, where he was speaking and then decided to stop without saying why.
well, and it's sort of the thing that Yaman said is that you start out 100% clean and then you slowly chip away at it. And the only two things that don't chip away at it are I'm asserting my right to remain silent and I'm asserting my right to an attorney. And it's the case now that everything you say, including not saying anything, chips away at it.
Now, if they come to you as, let's say, a masjid member, they're not coming to you as,
Yeah.
does the same right apply when they come to your home, or they come here as FBI? Can use the same approach as attorney, or is that something
Sure.
part of?
Yeah, there's no exception to this right. Absolutely not. Yeah, there's no exception to this right. So whether they come to you at your workplace, they come to you at school, they come to you in your dorm room, they come to you at your apartment, they come to you at the masjid, they come to you at Safeway, you still can say you want to have your attorney with you, and that you just take their business card and tell them you don't want to speak without an attorney.
The things I would add is if they come to you as sort of out and identified agents at the masjid leadership does have the authority to exclude anyone from the masjid, including the FBI. And in recent years, actually through Advancing Justice, Asian Law Caucus, and ACLU's great work around the Freedom of Information Act, they've obtained like thousands of pages of documents that showed how the FBI was visiting masajid, claiming to do outreach. So they would come to the iftar, they would come to Jummah prayer, they would talk to people, and they would take notes, lots and lots of notes about everything, and then those would eventually end up in intelligence files. So they would tell you that they were doing outreach, but they would end up in intelligence files. And as a result, a number of local masajid have said, look, like we need to rethink our relationship with law enforcement. And our advice has been that if you are going to invite law enforcement into your masjid, that you need to realize that you're putting the masjid at risk, that you're putting the community members at risk, and that it's very likely that whatever is shared will end up in an intelligence file. So certain masajid have decided to exclude them altogether. Other masajid have said, well, they're going to come, but we're going to make sure everybody knows who the FBI agents here are, so that people are careful when they talk to them. I do, sometimes masajid feel the need to build a relationship with law enforcement, because law enforcement's role is also to protect the masajid, in which case we strongly recommend building relationships with the local law enforcement. Like, your local agencies are definitely doing problematic things at times, but not in the way that the FBI is. And so the San Mateo, the Belmont Police Department, those are the places where the relationships are going to matter. The other thing is, when they come to the masajid undercover, right, as informants and infiltrators. And that's sort of a question that we've seen a lot of in there have been a number of high-profile cases. Many people are familiar with the case in Irvine in Southern California with Craig Monte. This was a man who was coming into the masjid pretending to be, he was pretending to be a convert to Islam, that always surprises me, because we're so nice to people who are just exploring the religion that you never have to pretend to be a convert to get that hospitality. But, he pretended to be a convert to Islam. He became really good friends with people. He would always leave his keychain, which was also a recording device, everywhere. Like, he became known for it. And as he got more and more comfortable in the community, he started to talk to some of the young men in the community about engaging in violent jihad, or going abroad, or doing something of that sort. So much so that it frightened the community members, and they called the local organizations like CAIR and the ACLU, and they also called law enforcement, and they eventually got a restraining order against the man, which got him fired by the FBI, because he couldn't do his job spying on the community and infiltrating if he couldn't go anywhere near the masjid. Then he was promised like some crazy 6-figure salary, and then he turned around and he sued the FBI for like breach of contract, right? Is that?
I don't remember his particular.
Okay, so I'm paraphrasing a bit, but like he turned around and he went after the FBI and outed them. And so the lessons from that are, it's really important that, so some lessons. The lessons from that are, if people are identifying themselves as agents, it's clear. You know your right to remain silent, your right to an attorney. If someone is talking to you about violent terrorism or breaking the law or anything of that sort, they used to say in the anti-war movement in the 60s that person is probably most likely the informant. Like, that person, the person that wants you to go pick up a gun and fight someone, that might be the informant. There are no guarantees. There are certain people in our community who hold those beliefs. There are certain people in our community who are mentally unstable, right? And who may say or do different things. So the 2 rules. One is, you should never say or do anything that you wouldn't want to see in an FBI file or the front page of the New York Times. This isn't a Muslim thing. I remind people of Anthony Weiner, a congressman from New York, who, infamously tweeted out some very inappropriate pictures and eventually had to resign, right? And then he ran for mayor and he did the same thing and lost that race as well. Huh? It tells you something, right? Is that if one of the most powerful men in the United States couldn't keep his private life private, like he thought he was sending a private message and it ended up all over the newspapers, we are no safer than that, right? The same is true for FBI files. If you say it or do it, it's potentially something that ends up somewhere. So be thoughtful about what you're saying, which conversations you're engaging in. If you come across someone who is promoting violence or something that you think is inappropriate in any way, approach your masjid leadership. If you cannot approach your masjid leadership, or if you are the masjid leadership, approach the organizations like CAIR, the Asian Law Caucus, the ACLU, et cetera. The other rule is that we want to be careful to not be suspicious of our community members. Like, Islam teaches us that suspicion of each other is sort of something that we don't do, right? That we should always give everyone 70 excuses and be mindful of that. So we learn it from Islam. We also learn it from, again, the anti-war movement and the era of the civil rights era and COINTELPRO. One of the specific objectives of COINTELPRO was to divide activism and to sort of undermine movements. And how do you do that? There's 25 of us here. If I think maybe 1 or 2 people are informants, right? Like, am I going to focus on the workshop and organizing it, or am I going to be so scared and worried and talking to people about that one person? So it can actually be very damaging, and that was one of the objectives. And so nowadays, what the anti-war activists will say is, if we think someone's an informant, we get them involved and we take advantage of the free labor. That's not to say that you shouldn't be careful, but just that you don't want to be suspicious of each other as well, because that can be destructive.
One thing that actually is your online profile and your social feed on your online profile is also a contributing factor on pretty much evaluating your risk factor of the FBI visit. So it's becoming like more of an online profile, I think, rather than
I mean, absolutely. So
Center that they built.
yeah, no, absolutely. So everything that you put on the web, like, is public, it's forever. If you delete it, it's still there. Like, we learned that as a result of, like, sort of all of the recent leaks about exactly how much of what we're doing is being watched. The counter to that is there's actually a really great TED Talk by someone who was followed by the FBI a couple of times, and so what he decided to do was, like, live tweet and live post everything in his life. He said, you don't need to follow me, let me just put it all out there. And so there are different approaches to it, but I don't think that you should be afraid of using social media. You should just be mindful of the fact that whatever you put out there, again, could end up in an FBI file or the New York Times.
Also, just because you write it in Arabic or a different language doesn't mean it's private.
Right.
That's an important one.
Very true. Yeah. Yes.
You mentioned that if you let them in and you find nothing regarding tourism, they come again and again and again until you find something even minor. And it makes me think, is this what we want, to find something to put someone in jail? Is this an objective? Why is that?
They have a career incentive to bring prosecutions and make cases. I think that's an important element of that.
So is there a hotline in case you're falsely detained to
Right.
speak to, reach out to?
Yeah, sure. So that's actually a great question. I was going to ask, I'll get them. Do you want to just get the pamphlets that are on that table right there? Yeah.
And I have another question as well.
Sure. So one thing is the answer to your question is that there's a bunch of pocket guides that are going out, but there's also that everyone they stay in your wallet. Some of our most senior community members have had them in their wallets for a decade. They have all the CAIR numbers on them. There's also more pamphlets on the table that have Asian Law Caucus numbers, ACLU numbers. Great to just always have it with you. I do also give out my cell phone number because I recognize that people don't always get visited by the FBI during business hours, and so if you need to get that, or if you'd feel comfortable having it, I tell people it's 626-252-0885. You can save it and call it at any time. That said, two things. One is the interaction is entirely voluntary. So that means, and this is difficult to remember when we're scared, but that you control the interaction. So you can say, look, I'll call you next week, I'll call you next month, or I'll never call you. And that means that the urgency is really sort of something that we impose on ourselves. And so remembering that, I think, sort of alleviates a little bit of the urgency. The other thing is most of the numbers on the documents, people are checking regularly, and so they're responsive. You can generally call them from abroad. If you are a non-citizen who's had trouble traveling because of invasive questioning by law enforcement or security screening or whatnot, we do recommend consulting with an attorney before you go again. If you're a citizen who's had the same troubles, again, consult with an attorney, but your rights are a little more solid, and so it's a little different. Yeah. There was a second question.
Yeah, so if your spouse is not a citizen yet, and you are, and you're coming from, Middle East or whatever, and you're detained before coming in, is there any special rights to the non-citizen spouse, or can they exclude her from entry? It would be just treated the same?
The same, right. So any non-citizen can be excluded from entry at the border. And so if it's something that has happened before where someone's been questioned at the border and is a non-citizen, again, it's just really important to sort of find out, consult with an attorney before going. That way, in case it happens again, you're fully prepared. I think I've seen one case of a spouse excluded at the border, and I imagine that it happens a lot. It gets talked about a lot in the immigration reform context because there are a lot of, for example, Latino families that are split up in that way, right? Where people are parents and their spouses and they're still dealing with deportation, and so it can happen.
One thing I forgot to mention before is that if you are a non-citizen and you are coming back into the country and it seems like they're going to be deporting you back to where you came from, if you have a fear that you'll be tortured or subjected to inhumane treatment in the country that you came from, you should say that immediately, and that will entitle you to special additional rights and additional process as they review that.
So, would you recommend for a non-U.S. citizen who's just a green card holder, okay, who's in the process of later becoming a U.S. citizen, if they travel, would you recommend them to travel with their U.S. spouse, or does it really matter? Okay, let's say if I travel abroad by myself and then I come back because my spouse can't come with me. I mean, would that be more of an issue than if he was with me? Like, does he serve as some sort of protection for me because he's a U.S. citizen?
My impression is no, that it does not, and
So it doesn't really matter.
doesn't matter. Yeah. Yes.
So you talked about a lot of fake calls coming in.
Yeah.
And read it about that in the press. How can you, so two questions. One is, how can you identify an FBI agent or somebody else who can see the role that they really are?
Mhm.
Who they are? That's number one. Number two, you talked about not having to say, tell them they want to exercise your rights. Can you do that from behind the door, or do you have to open the door?
Good questions. So to the first question, generally FBI agents will have business cards with them. I don't know that FBI agents carry badges. So some other law enforcement agencies carry badges, so that would be one way. FBI agents do generally have business cards. If they don't have a business card, I would be suspicious.
Anybody can print a business card.
It's true. And if that were to happen, then that person would also be dealing with charges of like impersonating law enforcement. And so whether or not, I guess the same advice for whether with a scam phone calls or FBI agents is ask for the business card if they have it and they give it to you, or if they don't have it and they don't give it to you, right? Like whether they're real or they're fake, your role or your actions should be the same.
Can you ask for his ID?
For his ID. I think you can. Yeah, I think you can ask for the ID.
You can ask for the badge.
You can ask for the badge, yeah. Yeah, so you can ask for that. They may or may not show it to you. We've seen some agents who are like real agents who will get difficult and who won't want to give you the business card. And our advice to clients then is, you're not supposed to be, you shouldn't be talking to them. If they're not giving you the business card, the message is very clear. Look, my attorney can't call you if you won't give me a business card. So thank you, have a nice day.
You don't have to open the door, by the way. You can say it through the door if you want.
Right, through the screen.
If you're in a circumstance where you feel like you don't know who the person is and it's actually dangerous, it's the middle of the night and you don't want to let a stranger in, it's totally fine to not open the door at all. The only way they can come into your house, as Zahra said before, without your permission is if they have a warrant signed by a judge. Most likely if they have that warrant, they may not even knock or wait for you to open the door.
I'm thinking more for the older kids, like the teenagers,
Right.
or whatever, like you have to open the door.
Yeah, so.
Yeah. They don't have to open the door, yeah.
And I would definitely recommend for those of you that have families and friends, take the materials on the tables, like give those out to people. Particularly in families, it is really important that like people who are, so whether it's spouses or children, that they also know. So like you may have made a decision that like, we're only going to talk to law enforcement from the screen unless they have a search warrant, they can slip their business card under the door. That decision doesn't mean very much if the people that are home aren't also doing it. Yes?
Can you also remind everyone that about the search warrant, first, how they can claim they have a search warrant, and it's your fault if you open the door if you don't ask for the proof.
Right. Yes. So remember, law enforcement is allowed to lie to you. That includes threats, promises, and assertions of fact. So they may say, like, you're going to say, look, and they're going to say, can I come in? And you'll say, well, do you have a search warrant? And if they say yes, you should ask to see that search warrant, right? Make sure, by the way, that the address on the search warrant is correct and that it is signed. If you didn't ask to see it and you let them in, doesn't matter that there wasn't a search warrant because you consented. If the address is incorrect, they don't get to come into your house. And so you do want to actually look at the search warrant. And even still, you have the right to remain silent and the right to an attorney. And so if they come in with a search warrant, that doesn't mean that you sit in your living room and spill your guts to them, right? So we've actually I remember we got some calls where like 6 to 10 agents will show up. Some of them will search the house and a couple of them will sit there and talk to the person. And the person is so scared that they're going to talk about everything. You still have the right to remain silent and the right to an attorney. And that's probably when you should be asserting it the most. And so you want to not speak to law enforcement, be polite, let them in, and then call for an attorney as soon as possible.
The other important thing about that is the search warrant only authorizes them to search what it says they can search in the search warrant. So if the search warrant says they can search your house, they can't search your car in the front yard. They might come to you and ask you for permission, but you don't have to say yes. You should say, no, I don't consent. If they go ahead and search it anyway, then later you can say, I didn't consent, and that might be grounds to suppress whatever they might have found there.
What about searching the person? Because, there's that case going on with what happened in Boston, and one of their friends, one of the FBI agents, they said one of the kids that was associated with those guys in Boston, they claimed he went
So
So
you're,
what about the search warrant? Is that
Right.
include that they can search the person? You know,
right. So,
because they're claiming, oh, he went for a knife.
no, yeah. So we, for those that are not familiar with the case that Brother Moti is referring to, it's Todashev, I forget the brother's first name, but it's Todashev, and this was a man who was friends with some of the Boston bombers, and it wasn't that there was a search warrant, and it wasn't that they were searching his body. In his case, what happened was the FBI reached out to him, they said, we want to meet with you, and he agreed. And I think he actually met with them multiple times. So the last time he met with them was, I think, the second or third time. He met with them in his home without an attorney present for multiple hours. And again, this was more than once. And on the last time he was there was, I think, a friend or a roommate or someone who was there, and that person was sent away. And in the hours that followed, they say that he continued to talk to them, and at a certain point they had gotten him to confess or nearly confess, not to the Boston bombing, but to some earlier crimes that he'd done with the brothers. And then they say he got angry and he went for a knife and he tried to stab an officer, and they shot and they killed him multiple times. So CAIR Florida is actually representing his family in a lawsuit or some action around this. And the concerns are, of course, the guy didn't live to tell his side of the story. So whether or not he reached for a knife, we'll never know, right? The agent's stories, we've heard different versions, they don't all match up. The lessons there are, of course, never engage in a physical interaction with law enforcement, right? Like, if they attack you, you should not fight back. If they're not attacking you, don't fight back at all. But his mistakes, his judgment is with Allah, but his mistakes from a civil rights perspective were he should never have met with law enforcement in his home without an attorney present. Even in the rare cases where we do assist people in meeting with the FBI, it never happens at a home. It never goes for hours and hours, right? So those were some of the issues there.
I think the challenge is for so many of the members of the Muslim community here in America who are not U.S. citizens,
Right.
who are in the process of getting their citizenship, they get very easily intimidated, and that's
Even for U.S. citizens, I know some people who are traveling on business trips
Right.
actually, really high-ranking places and their companies, and just because they're Middle Eastern, pretty much they were stopped actually they're U.S. citizens, they were stopped actually at the airport, and many times they would actually use their connection, and they would stay for 6 hours.
Right.
And the only thing that would happen to them is that the officer would ask him what was the purpose of your trip. This is exactly the same question that was basically
Right.
answered at the interview, right? The initial interview. And he would ask the same question, just add about maybe 2-3 hours. So pretty much the only reason, the only thing that happened when he just lost that first flight, and then happened so many times.
Yeah, I don't know, if you guys did a nice statistic breakdown. What's the breakdown from what you know from the Muslim community? How many people generally know their rights amongst our community?
We haven't done any studies to see how many people know their rights. The other statistics that I've been dreaming of sort of putting together is how many people that are visited are citizens versus non-citizens. I can tell you, though, that just based on the demographics of sort of where CAIR is, right? So CAIR is in Santa Clara, right in the middle of Silicon Valley. Definitely you have refugees, you have non-citizens, you have low-income families, but there are a lot of middle-class and upper-middle-class families, a lot of citizens, a lot of people that are very well-educated. And so we get clients that are citizens that didn't know their rights. Like, I've seen people who are citizens, not know their rights and talk to law enforcement. People who are, European descendant, Caucasian American Muslims, converts to Islam, not assert their rights. And so it's why we do the workshops. It's why I ask people to feel very comfortable saying, look, my attorney will call you, because anyone who's gotten a speeding ticket can tell you that, yeah, you might be more scared if you're undocumented, but even if you're a citizen, you're a little scared. And so it happens. Any other questions? Okay. Jazakallah khair for coming. So like I said, I've said over and over, there's lots of material on the table. Please do take some, keep some for yourself, take some for your family. Question? Yeah.
I heard a case about a man went to Saudi Arabia for a trip,
Mm-hmm.
and the FBI did without a warrant a break and entry of his house while he wasn't there, or something like that,
Mm-hmm.
and without a warrant, and I'm not sure if he got fired up, but like, yeah, I heard that.
So I'm not familiar with that case. I would not put it, you know, these days when we talk about law enforcement, nothing is impossible. And that's sort of a sad reality. Nothing is impossible. If that were to happen to someone, and I would strongly advise them to seek legal assistance, right? To call one of the organizations to figure out what exactly happened, what their rights are, and what can be done. But that doesn't sound legitimate to me, and at the same time, it doesn't sound impossible. Yeah. So thank you all so much for coming. Like I said, yes. Oh, yeah.
This
No,
is
please.
a case that you're familiar with, but there was actually a case, I think probably maybe in the Bay Area, somewhere in California, of a GPS device that was planted on a brother's car, and he eventually found out about it, and the FBI were asking for the device back.
Yeah. No.
So I'm curious.
Yes.
What
Yeah,
are
yeah.
your? What are your? I mean, anything in my car is mine. I presume. So, what are my obligations? Am I obligated to give it back to them,
Right.
or am I allowed
Yeah.
to hold on to it as a piece of evidence against them?
Those are really good questions. So you're referring to Yasser Afifi, and I apologize because it's such a frightening case, but it's also one that evokes sort of a humorous reaction from the community because it's so surreal. So for those who are not familiar with it, this was in 2010. I think he was about 19 at that time. Arab American college student from Santa Clara. His father was had passed away, but was one of the co-founders or leaders of MCA. Sort of ordinary kid, like not overly religious, not particularly political. He had his brothers in Egypt. He would support them. He, worked in sales, and he was in college. And he took his car in for an oil change, and he looked under his car, and he found a black box about this big, and then a black battery pack about this big. It was pretty, it was also really huge, right? And they said, what is this? And they took pictures of it, and they posted it online, and they figured out it was a GPS tracking device. And then, do you throw it in a lake? Do you attach it to a police car? Do you sell it on eBay? Like, they had all those conversations. And before they could do anything, the FBI showed up outside of his apartment, and they said what you said, we want it back, right? I think they said, we'll make things complicated if you don't give it to us. And he gave it to them, right? Whether or not he was obligated to give it to them, I think that question remains undecided. But it's sort of like, when you have half a dozen agents outside of your house, are you going to play Mr. Smart Guy and say, no, I'm not giving it to you? Or are you going to give it to them? I don't know, right? I don't know what I would have done. Right, and here's the thing is that maybe he should have sold it faster, right? Now that we know, if any of you find one on your car, definitely, post it on eBay, but also call us to let us know so that we can be on call in case they show up at your house. But with that said, so he gave it back to them, and the whole story just sounded so, fake. It just, I remember, my first reaction was really? And everyone's reaction was that way, but the mechanic verified it. The mechanic who was with him during the oil change verified it. The FBI verified it because we got a copy of his files, and then of course there were all the pictures of the thing. And so we, and then they asked him a bunch of questions. So they did the thing where they interviewed the client, and they asked him about community leaders, they asked him about his trip, they asked him about dinner plans he had. And then he came to us, and we sued the FBI on his behalf. And what was interesting was part of that was the FBI at one point said to him, you're a lot more boring than we thought, and this isn't going to go anywhere. They told us once that that they were no longer interested in him, and then 6 months later they wanted to talk to him again, and he has since continued to assert his rights. We sued the FBI on his behalf. 6 months to a year later, we put the lawsuit on hold, we got a stay, because the ACLU National had had a similar lawsuit on behalf of someone who was accused of selling drugs. And that case was a decade old, but it was finally going to the U.S. Supreme Court. And it's Jones v. United States. And in that case, they'd done the same thing. So in that case, actually, they got a warrant for the tracking device. And it was a 30-day warrant, and for some reason, they fell asleep on it, and they attached the tracking device on day 31. So the warrant had expired. And so when they found whatever evidence against him, he said, you can't use this against me, this was an illegitimate search. The Supreme Court, this was 2012 is when the decision came out, they said that the attachment of the device to the car was a violation of his rights. They never got into like, was the following him, was the collection of information, any of that. They simply answered it at the attachment, right? And that's great for Yasser's case. The problem is that device, that technology is so outdated. They don't need to attach anything to your car when they can follow you via your GPS in your phone, or when AT&T and Verizon are giving them all of that information. And so, lawyers want to file lawsuits about everything, and that should be done. And obviously it's what we do at CAIR, it's what they do at Asian Law Caucus, and we support that. But I also sort of advise people that like community organizing and pushback is really important, right? That the outrage is important, that talking to our elected officials is important, because by the time the Supreme Court reached the decision, law enforcement wasn't really using that technology anymore. Like, it's the other thing that makes Yasser's case so funny is nobody knows why. It was like they had an extra piece of material that they decided to stick on his car. It made no sense. And then the last point on that is that, so people will sometimes ask us, should I look under my car for a GPS tracking device? We got a lot of those questions that year, in 2010 especially. And the thing is, we can all go outside the masjid right now and we can look under our cars today. We'd have to do it again tomorrow, and the next day, and the next day. The other problem is, again, the technology is changing. So they don't need to attach anything to your car. They can listen to you otherwise, right? So what's the advice, right? The advice is don't be scared. Be cautious and be vigilant. Know that anything that you say and do, anywhere you drive your car, can end up in an FBI file. But the objective of these workshops and these stories is never to scare the community. That's actually the last thing we want. We want the community to be empowered. So know your rights, know how to protect yourself, know how to protect your community. To feel angry that the rights are being violated, and to channel that anger in a positive way. So whether it's volunteering at the organizations, or donating to the organizations, or hosting a workshop for your family, or getting involved, or talking to your elected officials, or writing to the media, to take that anger and put it into positive use. And then the third piece is to sort of spread the word. So the case that went to the Supreme Court was a case from the war on drugs. These were people who were being, black and brown people for decades, where everyone was treated as suspect. Like the same way that Muslims now, every Muslim's a terrorist, every African American, every Latino was a drug dealer. And the thing that I sort of always reflect back is the Muslim community, particularly the immigrant Muslim community, never thought that impacted us, right? Like we said, well, we don't do drugs. Like we're not bad. The police can do what they want to do. It's why I watch Law and Order. It's why a lot of our kids grow up watching Cops, because we sort of raise them with that culture and we don't question what's happening. And the reality is, when they stopped paying attention to African Americans and Latinos, it was our turn, right? Prior to African Americans and Latinos, it was communists, and there was Japanese Americans. And so the education that we do inside our community, but also with our allies today, will ensure that whoever comes next, whether it's Anonymous or Occupy or Syria activists or whoever, that will have set the groundwork in place to protect them.
A couple years ago, there was an interview with, I think, Jack Dorsey at Twitter, and he was saying that, if the government would contact Twitter and saying, hey, we want history about this member, I think he said that we would reach out to that member and just say, hey, and we'd give them like 7 days, clean up your tweets, and go from there. So what's happening right now in the civil rights arena? Is it going to, because the government, of course, they're going to always do what they can get away with.
Right.
But is it going to be better that we say, the telecom companies, the internet companies, no, we say that if somebody's asking for our information, because we know now with the phone companies, all that they have to do is just go to a judge, and judge just signs off, and that's it, and you never know. But I don't think we should just leave all that power to a judge.
Right.
So what's happening in that sense that, no, the companies, they contact us, okay, fine, whomever, you're registered with, so-and-so, they're asking for your information. So what's happening?
There's a number of websites online that rate how these companies do on civil liberties. Like they look at Google and like AOL and all of them, right? And so, your money is powerful. Like who you do business with matters. This is true for phone companies, for example. So if Verizon is turning over all of your information, you should question, is the iPhone deal that you got really worth it, right? And so I'm not here selling phones. I'm just saying that that pick your companies wisely, hold your companies accountable, and then also, really utilize elected officials to push back. So I think recently there was the USA Freedom Act that was introduced? Yeah, so there was like some legislation that was introduced, and I don't know the details, but it was introduced to and it's an attempt to sort of rein in the NSA. And people should support it. Like, you should be writing letters to your elected officials in support of it. And when your elected officials are making decisions or saying things that are not good, so for example, Senator Dianne Feinstein has a really problematic record. Like, she's on the Intelligence Committee. She's got a really problematic record in terms of saying that Snowden should be punished, that legitimizing what the NSA is doing, and any reform that she's pushed hasn't gone far enough. But you know what? She's also in a very secure seat in California. And 501c3, I'm not advocating for another candidate. I'm just saying that you should hold her accountable. That when they do good, thank them, but when they're screwing up and they're not representing you and really, voting in your best interest, that you should hold them accountable as well. It is a very, I would say, frightening time, because law enforcement powers are continuing to grow and the checks are sort of minimal. And it's why, again, that I would not rely on the Supreme Court, which may take a decade to get, at this point, most of the decisions have been bad, but it may take another decade to get a good one. It's going to really take all of you educating each other, educating your families, holding your elected officials accountable, and doing things like hosting more workshops and writing to your local papers to really raise awareness.
But see, technology-wise, your digital presence, digital signature, and profile are your responsibility.
Yeah.
Do not assume privacy.
Yeah.
Even private companies and private citizens can get all the information about you with no warrant. So you don't assume Uncle Sam needs to do that. So it's just, if it's on the wire and it goes from one endpoint to another, any good technical guy can do it.
No, but in particular, the telephone companies, I think, because there's more, phones on this planet than our computers. But just lastly about, so what was the main reason why you stopped pursuing that?
Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't finish that. So no, that lawsuit is pending. So the government has filed it. So we stayed it until the ACLU got their decision from the Supreme Court, and then it's been resumed. And then the government filed a motion to dismiss, and we responded, and we're sort of just waiting for the judge. And those things can take years. And so even as a lawyer, I tell people that lawsuits are generally not the solution to major social problems.
So when the FBI or any form of law says, if you don't do this and that, if you don't give us the device back or whatever they say, we will make it complicated for you. If we exercise our rights, if we remain silent, or whatever we do, can we use that as a threat against them, or are they legally are they allowed to say that? Can that be held against them in any way?
No. So they're allowed to lie to you, they're allowed to intimidate you, they're allowed to threaten you. The flip side of it is they're also allowed to make you promises, right? But if I had a friend who was a liar, who made me promises, I probably wouldn't believe them, right? In the same way, if I had a friend who was a liar who made threats, I may or may not believe them. And so there are no consequences to them. And so it's really just about protecting yourself. Anything else? No, Jazakallah khair for coming. Please take the materials. There's a sign-up sheet, so if you want to get on the newsletters for Asian Law Caucus or CAIR, please sign up so we can have your email address and keep you in the loop, inshallah. Jazakallah khair.